CDH Films presents an animated short in Lego, The Lightning Thief. Book 1 of Percy Jackson and the Olympians, from the original novel by Rick Riordan, narrated to you by me, Chris. Once upon a time there was a 12-year-old New Yorker named Percy Jackson, who lived with his loving and caring mother, Sally Jackson, and his cruel, selfish, lazy stepfather, Gabe Ugliano, or Smelly Gabe. Percy was also dyslexic, had ADHD, and knew nothing about his real dad, not what he did in life, why he left Sally before Percy was even born, or even who he was. And Percy didn't always live with his mom and stepdad, because he was always sent away to go to boarding schools. At his current school, Yancey Academy, he had only one friend named Grover Underwood, who seemed a little old for 6th grade. There was also a handicap teacher named Mr. Bruner, who kept a close watch on Percy, and a middle-aged lady dressed in black leather named Mrs. Dodds, who also kept a close watch on Percy. One day on a field trip to the Metropolitan Museum, a girl named Nancy Bobafitz picked a fight with Percy. Percy felt offended, but how did she fall into the fountain? Percy couldn't remember, but everyone thought it was him who pushed her in. Percy was in big trouble now, and this time with Mrs. Dodds. She took him back inside, and when no one else was in the room, she stretched out her arms and her jacket spread out into wings. Mrs. Dodds was really a monster. But then Mr. Bruner came in and tossed Percy a pen, which somehow turned into a sword when it landed in his hand, as if by magic. In one shot, he swung the blade into the monster, and it turned to dust. But then the sword was a pen again, and Percy was alone. Then he went back outside and gave Mr. Bruner back the pen. What happened to Mrs. Dodds? Percy wondered. But Mr. Bruner tried to convince him there was no Miss Dodds. Now Percy was confused. Then one night, Percy wandered around the school halls. He heard Grover talking to Mr. Bruner in his office, telling him that he was worried about Percy. Then he saw a strange shadow on the wall and ran back to bed, still in a sea of confusion. By the end of the school year, Percy got a letter telling him that he was not invited back to Yancey Academy. Feeling bad for his friend, Grover tried to ask Percy to let him walk him home. Percy tried to convince him it was a bad idea, but Grover somehow talked him into it. So they were off into the city and heading back to Sally's apartment in Manhattan. Until they were halfway there and the bus needed repairs. While everyone waited on the side of the road, Percy spotted a trio of strange old ladies who seemed to be staring at him as they were cutting the thread of a rather huge sock. But then the bus was back in gear and they were on the road again. For whatever reason, those ladies had Grover worried sick. When they finally reached the city, Grover made a quick stop to the restroom. Then Percy was having second thoughts about bringing Grover home with him. He would be too embarrassed, so he called a cab and abandoned Grover. Now Grover was worried to death. Percy finally made it home after a long, hard, and weird semester. When he got inside, he got a surprise. His mom planned a trip to where she met his dad. It would be just the two of them. And Gabe was kind enough to lend him his car, for once, and gave Percy a good warning not to get it busted. When they got there, it was storming like crazy. Sally talked about how she first met his dad and that there was a camp he wanted Percy to go to. Then there was a knock at the door. It was Grover, all soaking wet, and what was wrong with his legs? He was all out of breath, trying to say that he was searching for Percy all night, and that he was right behind them. Then Percy let out the whole Mrs. Dodds situation. Instantly panicked, Sally pushed Percy to the car, and they zoomed down the road across Long Island. They talked about the fact that Mrs. Dodds was a Fury, the old ladies were the Three Fates, and Grover was a satyr sent to protect Percy. Then from out of nowhere, a streak of lightning hit the car, sending it flying and crashing into a ditch with the roof ripped off. In the distance, Percy could make out a huge shadowed figure charging toward them. Sally pointed at a tree on a nearby hill where the figure couldn't follow them. Percy had to get up there, but he couldn't just leave them. Grover was hurt, so they carried him across the road. When the figure got closer, it threw away the car. Then Percy got a good look at it. It was the ancient mythical Greek monster called the Minotaur. It charged at them, got hold of Sally, and made her disappear into a flash of light. Percy decided to fight back and charge him. Then he managed to snap off one of its horns, and then he stabbed it right in the chest and it turned to sand. Even though he felt terrible for losing his mom, Percy still helped Grover up the hill. When they got to the other side, there was a huge blue farmhouse. From all the exhaustion, Percy passed out on the porch. The last thing he saw before passing out was a familiar-looking man who seemed a little tall and a pretty girl with princess hair. The last thing he heard the moment he was out was the girl saying, "He's the one." As he slept, he could have sworn he heard the girl's voice say, "What happens on the summer solstice? What was stolen? There's only a few weeks." When he woke up, he saw Grover in an orange t-shirt and jeans. Percy could only assume the whole thing was just a bad dream. At least until Grover showed him the minotaur horn. Even though he felt bad all of a sudden, Percy was now wondering where he was. Next to him was a middle-aged man in a Hawaiian shirt named Mr. D. And Mr. Brunner was there too. Nearby was the blonde girl, and her name was Annabeth Chase. She mentioned to Percy he drooled in his sleep right before she walked away. They told him he was in a summer camp called Camp Half-Blood, and an amazing camp it was. The pine tree on the hill was the entrance to the camp, and the blue house was the HQ. It also had a canoe lake, an arena, a rock climbing wall with lava, an armory, a monster-infested forest, and the most amazing collection of cabins for the campers. The camp was supposed to be a sanctuary for kids called demigods, who were offsprings of ancient Greek gods. Percy knew that couldn't have been true because those were just myths. But Mr. D assured him they were not myths, otherwise he wouldn't be here. Then Percy took a wild guess that Mr. D was Dionysus, the god of wine. And he guessed it right. And who else could he have been? Aphrodite? Then he got up and had Grover come inside with him. Grover was in big trouble now. Then Mr. Brunner decided to give Percy a tour and explain things. As Percy watched, he pulled his bottom half out of the chair and revealed himself to be a centaur. Would you say it's coincidence that Percy just learned his teacher is half animal? Mr. Brunner also revealed himself as Chiron, the trainer of heroes. Zeus, the god of lightning, let him live as long as heroes needed his help. The mortals never saw the monsters because a powerful force called the Mist was hiding them, which would explain the unnoticeable disappearance of Mrs. Dodds. He also told him the gods kept traveling west to wherever the stars shined the brightest, right till they were currently in the USA. And there were signs and evidence all across the country, pictures and statues, like the US symbol was an eagle, like Zeus, or how there's pictures of Hermes' catechus in hospitals, and even a statue of Prometheus in Rockefeller Center, and Atlas. If the gods were real, Percy wondered, then that must mean the underworld was real too, and that's where Mom went. As far as Chiron knew, this camp was the only safe place for Percy, or any demigod. Then they ran into Annabeth Chase again. Chiron asked her to take Percy to cabin 11, the Hermes cabin. When he got there, he saw it was super crowded. The only one who welcomed him was the cabin's head counselor, a 19-year-old guy named Luke Castellan. But Percy didn't stay there too long. He caught up with Annabeth again and started asking questions. He asked about the cabin arrangements, and she said, "It all depends on who your godly parent is." You see, each of the cabins represented each of the 12 Olympian gods. Male gods on the left, females on the right, with the first two cabins next to each other at the end representing the king and queen, Zeus and Hera. On Zeus's side were Poseidon, Ares, Apollo, Hephaestus, and Hermes. On Hera's side were Demeter, Athena, Artemis, Aphrodite, and Dionysus, who was not female. She told him that Athena, the goddess of wisdom in battle, was her mom. Also that cabin 11 was not just for Hermes kids, but also used as just somewhere to put the demigods who didn't know which particular god was their parent. All this made Percy learn one thing. His real dad was one of the 12 Olympian gods. Now he just had to find out which one. She also mentioned that dyslexia and ADHD were common in demigods. Reasons for dyslexia was because his mind was hardwired mainly for ancient Greek, and ADHD was really his demigod-like battle reflexes. Without them, he could have never survived fighting those monsters. Suddenly, a tough girl from the Ares cabin named Clarice came up to him and insisted to show him how she welcomed newcomers. By stuffing his head in the toilet! Percy struggled to keep his head out of the water. He was so scared when the water jumped up and splashed Clarice in the face and got everyone in the bathroom all wet. This would explain Nancy Bulbafits in the fountain. Feeling frustrated and embarrassed, Clarice and her siblings ran off. Percy had no idea how it worked, but he knew he made it happen, and he was the only one in the room completely dry. Annabeth was a little wet too, but she smiled at him. She wanted him on her team for capture the flag. But that wasn't until later. Hey, nice shirt, Percy. So for the next few days, Percy went through all the camp's training and activities to find out who his godly dad was. Was he fast like Hermes? Maybe not. Was he good at archery like Apollo? Nope. Was he good with gizmos like Hephaestus? No. Definitely not. And definitely not as tough as Ares. They didn't bother with the skills that Zeus or Poseidon were known for. Their cabins had no campers in them at all because they didn't have any kids for decades, so there was no way. Eventually, it came that time of the week for capture the flag. Just like she wanted, Annabeth had Percy on her team, and Clarice was on their enemy team, unfortunately. Before they started, they were reminded of the game's rules and instructions. The first team to capture their enemy's flag wins, and no killing. Both teams were separated from each other to the different corners of the woods. Then Annabeth had a great idea for a distraction. She had Percy stand by a creek alone, which was actually really far from the flag. However, that was supposed to work, but Annabeth said, Athena always has a plan. Then Clarice and her siblings came out of nowhere and still mad about the toilet situation. Clarice pushed Percy into the water, but he got up and fought back. He knocked one of them into the water and broke the other's helmet. Then he broke the tip of Clarice's electrical spear and pushed her down. The other campers came with Luke carrying the red flag. The blue team won and the game was over. They were number one. Not bad, hero, Annabeth complimented. I told you Athena always has a plan, she said. Though Percy didn't see her, at least until she appeared in sight after taking off a baseball cap which made her invisible. She noticed he healed rather fast, and when he got out of the water, he immediately felt exhausted again. Then a huge dog called a hellhound appeared out of nowhere and attacked him. But Chiron took care of that. Percy was hurt again, but Annabeth put him back in the water. Then his cuts healed super fast, and he felt better again. Then a glowing symbol shaped like a trident appeared over Percy's head. Though they were all shocked, everyone bowed to him in respect. Then Chiron said, Hail, Perseus Jackson, son of Poseidon. Okay, not what he expected, but at least now he knew who his dad was.